Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Welcome to episode number 247 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to thank some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Amy Ricker, Lady Annie, Hallie Edmister, Gina Farina, Joe Rogers, and Sandra George. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week. Our film review is The Deliverance. The Deliverance was released in 2024. It has 5.1 out of 10 on IMDb and 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. Ebony Jackson, a struggling single mother fighting her personal demons, moves her family into a new home for a fresh start. But when strange occurrences inside the home raise the suspicions of Child Protective Services and threaten to tear the family apart, Ebony soon finds herself locked in a battle for her life and the souls of her children, inspired by a true story. And if you are interested in listening to that true story, we did an episode on the House of 200 Demons. It was episode number 175 and it was released on November the 13th, 2022. So if you've seen the film and you want to refresh your memory on the story and how the story compares to the film, that is the place to go and listen. And look, you know, we're going to do our likes and dislikes, and I've got a lot to say about this. So we're going to start with the likes, okay? And I really expected to absolutely hate this film. I think because of the way I'd seen people talking about it online, I was like, oh, I'm going to hate this film, and this film review is going to be like somewhat funny and tongue-in-cheek and a bit silly. But actually, I was genuinely pleasantly surprised at how nuanced and well written this was in the beginning. Note how I said in the beginning there, okay? I was gripped from the start, right? I was like, oh shit, this feels like a really good family drama. I'm here for it. I'm interested, okay? You piqued my interest. So as I said, the story centres around Ebony Jackson, who is like this struggling single mother, and Glenn Close plays her mom. And initially I was like, Glenn Close, what are you doing here? What the heck? It seemed like such a strange role for her, but genuinely, I thought the performances of the lead characters in the first kind of half, maybe even the first 3/4 of this film, including the children, I thought they were brilliant. And I thought they felt believable. And Glenn Close and Ebony, their relationship was so complex. And I thought that it was portrayed so well. And I thought Ebony, the mum, like, she is such a great character. She was deeply flawed and so easy to dislike. But I couldn't help but like her. She's an alcoholic. She's struggling with poverty and raising a family on her own. And I just wanted to help her. I wanted things to go well for her. And when you see this dynamic with her mom and you get these like kind of indications as to what kind of childhood she had, you understand why she behaves the way she does. And she makes shitty decisions, but you can clearly see that she loves her kids and she's trying her best. And for a really long time in my teaching career, I worked with families in need, families who were in crisis, parents who were in crisis, kids who were in crisis. And I think we often judge parents who are struggling, right? And then when you kind of dig down into it, you start to realise that often the way people behave in life, it's a trauma response or it's the result of their upbringing. And even though in lots of cases people are like, I know this is the wrong thing to do, the way that they have lived their life previously, or the cards that have been handed to them for whatever reason, mean that they respond in a particular way. And I thought this was really well demonstrated in this film, and I genuinely thought the paranormal things that were happening in the house were spooky. Like, I thought they were really well done, because you had this chaotic hustle and bustle of everyday life, and then every so often weird shit was happening, and Ebony and the kids, they were noticing it but kind of going, oh, shit, that is weird, but there's too much life going on to really stop and take notice of what's happening. And there's bits of the story where the youngest boy, Andre, is doing like weird, spooky child shit in a horror film, the standard sleepwalking, banging his head on things, whatever. And I thought it was really accurate how Ebony responded to it, in that she was like, oh, I don't have time for you to be messing around. Just please go back to bed. Because I do think that in reality, we don't always assume that it's the paranormal. We don't always assume that it's something spooky going on, Sometimes you're just a frustrated ma who's at the end of her tether, who is just like, do you know what? I don't have time for this shit. And the fact that all of this family chaos was happening, you had social services that were involved, medical professionals that were involved with the family, and you had all this chaos going on, and then suddenly this paranormal stuff starts happening too in this new house that they've moved into, and the people around the family are like, oh, this is obviously the result of, trauma within the family and domestic violence and blah, blah, blah. And that's a real nuanced, interesting conversation about how people who are living maybe lives that are a little bit less straightforward, if they start having these paranormal experiences, are people going to believe them, or are they automatically going to assume it's because of the dynamic within the family home? There's brilliant moments where the kids are covered in bruises and the social workers are saying, hey, what happened to you? How did you get that bruise on your arm? How did you get that bruise on your leg? Whatever. And the kids are like, well, we don't know. And then because Ebony has a prior history of alcoholism and violent behaviour, it's immediately assumed that she is hurting the children. And that's this huge strain on Ebony and on the family, and is likely what would happen in real life. And I was so into this film. I was so ready to be like, yes, this is a 5-star film. This is brilliant. And then it just became a completely different film for the last third. It just fell off the rails completely, right? And it was so frustrating to watch, because it genuinely started with actual promise. I was watching this film in the middle of the day, right? In the morning time with the sunlight streaming in. And in the beginning, I was glued. I was feeling it. I was getting goosebumps at the scary bits. But then I honestly was like, this is so annoying. It was just ridiculous. And big spoiler alert, right? The end of this film descends into just absolute nonsensical chaos. Nonsensical chaos. And it was absolutely ridiculous. So to give you like context, the real story behind this incident is really interesting and probably more terrifying than the absolute nonsense they ended up using in this film. So in the real story, like, social workers and police officers said that they saw paranormal things happening in this house, including a social worker who testified that they saw the youngest boy walking backwards up the wall, right? That's scary. That's scary shit. But what we ended up with in this film was this weird kind of Exorcist style carnage at the end, where they do this big exorcism that becomes completely ridiculous and overblown and just ruined all of the nuance and subtlety and complexity that had been created earlier in the film. I genuinely think that an actual exploration of the real story would have been far more terrifying and far more thought-provoking if they had continued with the subtle paranormal activity and this through line where Ebony, the mother, is being blamed for all of these things, and a discussion about, hey, was this paranormal or was this a family in crisis? That would have been far more interesting than what they went with, which genuinely was laughable. Like, it was laughable, the things that happened in the last third of this film when they decided to do an exorcism. It was bizarre. We went from a real family drama to fucking pits to hell opening up in the bloody basement of this house, and windows all being blown in, and children levitating all over the place, and random stigmata, and like this little boy literally vanishing into thin air all the time and popping back up again like he's apparating out of fucking Hogwarts. As you can tell, I found this very stressful. And Lee Daniels, who directed this film, if you are listening, sometimes real life is more horrifying than anything paranormal. And maybe the real horror of this story could have been the horror of not being believed when something is genuinely happening in your house that you can't explain. Maybe that was the real horror and not the fucking travesty that was the last third of this film. I'm giving it 2 stars, right? I'm giving it 2 stars because I thought the performances were amazing. I thought the characters were initially amazing, really well fleshed out characters. But actually the paranormal elements and the way they decided to, reach the climax in this film was absolutely appalling. 2 stars for The Deliverance.
Hey, true crime fans. Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free true crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free true crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
As dawn broke over the 7 seas, the pirates of the Crimson Galleon set sail for adventure. But there was one problem. Paperwork. Mountains of it. Filing, invoices, you name it.
This work ain't fit for a pirate.
Luckily, their captain had an idea. She used the smart buying tools on Amazon Business, so they could work more efficiently and get back to doing what they do best. I know, right? Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Oh, that was a very frustrated rant, really, wasn't it? And I couldn't even find the humour in the rampage because I was so frustrated by that film. But we are moving swiftly on to our story this week. And this story is such a strange little story, and I found it in an article in the Fortean Times from October 2023. And I sort of initially thought like this would be a good like introduction to, another topic. But then when I dove into this article, and it was sort of like an inconspicuous article that I stumbled upon, I was really taken by this story. So it was written by a man called Jerry Glover about his own experience. And like I said, it's from the Fortean Times, October 2023. I think it's edition number 436. And I kind of took the article and gave it a bit of a narrative spin, as I generally do with these things. And there's bits of this story that are kind of like difficult to get your head around, but I tried to simplify it as much as I humanly could, because there was elements of it that I genuinely had to read a number of times to understand what it was talking about, because it goes into quite heavy theological discussion. So I've kind of, taken those elements and simplified them as much as possible. So if there's people from, the Buddhist faith or whatever who are listening and feel like, hang on, that's a very oversimplified version of what that means, I do apologize, but in order to make it understandable for people who aren't in the know like myself about Buddhism, it kind of made more sense to simplify it as much as possible. So we're gonna jump straight into the story. Let's get into it. If you've been listening to this podcast for a long time, you will know that I have a vested interest in cursed items. It's not that I necessarily believe in them being cursed per se. It's more that I'm interested in the human beliefs around cursed items. Many moons ago, I bought a Dybbuk box to make a YouTube video while opening it. I'm pretty sure I bought it on Etsy, and Dan refused to allow it into the house, so we had to open it in my car. It was full of odds and ends designed to look creepy and mysterious, and my takeaway was that someone was making some serious cash from selling any old tat in a creepy box. Frankly, I applaud them for it, but here's the thing. I didn't bring that thing into my house. Even then, even when I believed that a person had gathered up dusty old bits from around their house and popped them into a box, I still didn't bring it into my house. To be honest, it still freaked me out. I walked a few streets away from my house and chucked the whole lot in the bin. And even then, I still had the heebie-jeebies. There was this lingering sense of what if? What if it is real? What if I opened it and had inadvertently cursed us? It didn't, but the lore was powerful enough that I was freaked. Intellectually, I knew the story of the Dybbuk box is a complete fabrication. Oh, I'm sorry to break it to you if you are hearing that news for the first time, but it is a completely made up story and has no basis in either truth or Jewish lore. But even though I knew the story wasn't real, it still had the power to make me think twice. 956 days is a long time. And 956 days can change your life. It's about 2 years and 7 months, and a lot can happen in that time. And in the world of curses, it has the time to truly embed itself right into your life and your psyche. The listing on eBay was, to Jerry Glover at least, very exciting. It was 2014, and this was not one of the tens of thousands of haunted dolls that littered the website, nor was it the standard Dybbuk box listing that warned you to buy it at your own risk. This was listed as a unique Tibetan Bonpo shamanic ceramic amulet. It's quite the mouthful, and it was indeed quite the find. This thing was certainly unique. It was a small, emaciated creature, a 2-headed fetus, about 8 inches long, immortalized in stone and dabbed with an orange pigment. Along with this amulet came several wooden block-printed Buddhist texts, a piece of saffron cloth that was covered in swastikas, and to be clear, the swastika as used in Buddhism does not hold the same meaning as the swastikas used in the Nazi regime. In Buddhism, it symbolized harmony, peace, and well-being. Of course, that is a very simplistic explanation, but fundamentally, in Buddhism, the swastika is a positive symbol. What was also included in the listing, which Jerry Glover was most excited about, was a card confirming the item's authenticity that was written by Vladimir Zvolf, who had been an assistant keeper in the Department of Oriental Antiquities in the British Museum. This was the real deal. When it arrived, Jerry was overjoyed and so excited to add it to his collection of little oddities. He obviously had to examine it first, and as he turned the little object over in his hands, he was struck by how incredibly light it was. He had thought that it was ceramic or carved out of stone, but as he looked at it, examined it, and felt its distinct lack of weight, he began to doubt himself. The detail in the carving was extraordinary, and as he looked at it some more, he began to wonder whether this was a model at all. There was a faint hum of horror in his veins as he began to think that this may be mummified remains. He decided that to understand what he had bought, he needed to seek out the advice of experts in the field of objects such as this. The card explained a bit of what the strange object might mean. It said that there are 5 personal gods of the head in the Bon Po tradition, and that this amulet represented the unity of Po La, the male god, and Mo La, the female god. This did nothing to help Jerry understand the amulet, so he searched further afield. And here's what he discovered initially, and I'm going to keep this as concise as possible to avoid any confusion. Bon Po refers to followers of a religious tradition practiced in Tibet before Buddhism arrived. The practice had animistic shamanic roots. Animistic basically means that all objects, places, and creatures possess a distinct spiritual essence. It is estimated that the practice stretched back over millennia. The original Bon Po people are a people whose origins and religions are unknown. The practice of Bon developed in parallel with Tibetan Buddhism, and a lot of their teachings are similar. There are some big differences though, like the main deity in Bon is female and Earth is female. The scriptures of Bon teach of possession and exorcism, in which these dark and malevolent entities are brought into a priest's body and the priest battles the entity with fire. In Buddhism, this sort of practice is avoided. Throughout the years, Bon was often seen as something that was akin to a dark and incorrect version of Buddhism, and as a result, its followers were sometimes met with violence, but attitudes have changed slowly over the years. With a basic knowledge of the religious practice that this amulet had allegedly emerged from, Jerry sought more information about what the amulet could have been actually used for. The first task was to understand what the wood block text was, and it turned out that the texts were lists of mantras, culminating in a mantra for ritual purification. And then things began to get darker. Professor Charles Ramble was an expert in Bon and had spent 15 years studying the religion and its history in Nepal. His reply was somewhat alarming. I think it's an exorcism, but it isn't one that has been recorded. But I really don't think it's positive. I've consulted with colleagues and it doesn't seem to resemble anything that I have seen made by lamas or shaman from either Bon or Buddhism. I don't think it's related to the amulet, and I don't really think the card written by the curator adds any decent information. I think the text is like a red herring of sorts. I think it's there to purposefully mislead, but it's definitely text from teachings. I'm not sure of exactly what teachings and where, but I do think the text may come from the engraving on a stupa. A stupa is a dome-shaped shrine. What was even more alarming was that Professor Ramble also felt that it was pertinent to include a story in his response, and the story went like this. In the 8th century, there was a man named Drupka Ringmo, and he was out hunting sheep when he tragically slipped and fell off a cliff edge and died. But that was not the end of his story. He did not rest. He rose as a Rola, a zombie, and was now destined to wreak havoc wherever he roamed. As he roamed, every person he encountered was struck down and became a Rolang, and this horde of zombies made their way to a place called Sakya, destroying everything in their path. But a Buddhist Lama managed to subdue them with a magical fire and turned the zombies into blessed food. the local people were tasked with eating the consecrated food to fully subdue the Rolang, and one woman received a ring finger, which she point blank refused to eat. The ring finger sprang up and made to escape and was captured by the Lama and bound in his beads. In this very place, large stupas were built. These big dome-shaped shrines were there to protect the local people. Legend has it that cracks appear in these stupas when daughters are born to the local clan. But here's where it gets even weirder. Locals claimed that a child with several heads was extracted from one of these shrines, which means that either this was a real human child or children, whichever way you look at it, that was placed in a stupa or had a stupa built on top of it to protect the local people from the harm it would bring. Or it was an effigy used in the ritual to banish demons or vampires, both of which were closely associated with children. Is it possible that the text that came from the amulet was from the very stupa that was designed to protect the local people from it and from harm? Professor Ramble continued his correspondence by saying, "I can't imagine that any Tibetan would regard this as being something other than strange or dangerous." Jerry wasn't done with his digging yet. He had to know more about this thing. He consulted a man named Dmitry Ermakov, who admitted that he wasn't entirely sure what this was. He couldn't definitively place it, but he did say something definitive. This object may be a glud, which is a Tibetan ransom ritual, or designed to curse or harm. If you cannot ascertain what action this object is connected with, I would advise you to get rid of it. Because if it is meant as a repayment of karmic debt to some spirits, then by possessing it, you are depriving those whom it meant to appease of their payment, and they will haunt you. If it is meant as a curse, then it may transmit to you. The general rule regarding these kinds of Tibetan objects is, don't take it or buy it if you are not sure what it is for. Perhaps this should have been all the information that he needed to get rid of this strange little artifact. But he didn't. He kept it, not really any the wiser as to what this thing was or what it was used for. And life took a distinct downward turn. For many years, Jerry had been working on a research project, and suddenly the project seemed to become more and more expansive and unwieldy. He couldn't get his head around the information that he was gathering, and he seemed unable to fashion that information into any sort of cohesive arc or conclusion. It just grew and grew. Jerry became isolated and found it difficult to sleep, and even stranger, he began to find scratches all over his body. Scratches that he simply couldn't account for. He would, of course, tell himself that this was the result of his difficult night times. He had suddenly developed insomnia after all, that he was subconsciously scratching himself and not realizing that he had done it. A simple explanation. But that wasn't all. Suddenly, Jerry seemed to be some sort of catalyst for odd activity around the house. His method of unwinding was, like many, to play video games. He felt safe and relaxed when he was immersed in another world. But one day, while he was playing video games, something happened. It was only a small event in the general scheme of things, but it was enough to put Jerry on edge. A large, heavy book was leaning against a bookshelf in the room, and it simply tipped over, slamming onto the floor. This book was heavy, and it was leaning against a flat surface, where it had been for some time. It was physically impossible for it to tip over on its own. It didn't make any sense. Just a few days later, Jerry was standing next to the mantelpiece in his house in conversation with a friend. There was nothing unusual about the circumstances, but as his friend watched in a mixture of horror and amazement, Jerry seemed to completely zone out suddenly, like he had lost consciousness, his eyes glazed and unseeing. And in that moment, a small clay figurine that Jerry had made hopped off the mantelpiece and to the floor. This thing didn't just fall, it seemed to jump off the ledge. And with that, Jerry was back in the room. Jerry was plagued with night terrors. Terrifying creatures that resembled flying mice would invade his bedroom and fill him with dread. His emotional state was deeply affected. He felt himself sinking into a world of turbulent emotions. His dog became ill and had to be put to sleep. His neighbour, who was a close friend, passed away. 2 close relatives passed away. It felt to Jerry and his family that they were caught in a whirlwind of negativity. Emotions were constantly vibrating just below the surface, ready to erupt at any time. And Jerry began to think that perhaps the warnings about this strange amulet should have been heeded. Was it possible that this amulet was causing this sudden turmoil for his family? Had he ushered in a curse to his home? He contacted the Department of Ancient Egypt and Sudan at the British Museum, who surmised that it was unlikely that the amulet was actually mummified human remains, and that it was unlikely that it was based on an actual human anatomy. And while this was a relief, it didn't change anything. The amulet was still in his possession, and still seemed to be wielding a negative power over his family. The scratches continued and got worse over time. Jerry had convinced himself that this was somehow his own doing, but he had no recollection of how or when this could have been happening. Every single time the scratches would appear in the same pattern. 3 parallel scratches, 6 inches long. And Jerry couldn't help but think of poltergeist cases that he had read about that all recounted the same thing. 3 scratches, mysteriously appearing. He continued to stubbornly believe that he was somehow doing this himself, until it became abundantly clear that he wasn't. Jerry and his wife were getting ready for a funeral when it happened. He had slipped on his shirt, buttoned it up, and suddenly felt a warm, stinging sensation on his back. It was uncomfortable, and he unbuttoned his shirt and slipped it off, asking his wife to check his back, to look and see if she could see what was causing the sudden irritation. And there they were. 3 new scratches, hot and sharp on his back. They had not been there before. Both Jerry and his wife were sure of that, but yet there they were, vivid and angry on his back, in a place that he could not reach with his own hands. The strange and frustrating events continued. The family were plagued by mishaps. They all bundled into the car to travel 200 miles for a funeral, only to realise that they had gotten the day wrong. They were locked out of their house minutes before going on holidays. Of course, mishaps happen to people all the time, but these mishaps just felt weird, and in the context of the warnings about the strange 2-headed amulet, there seemed to be a malice in these mishaps. In the midst of it all, Jerry became unwell. He became seriously unwell. And it all began with a small cut on the sole of his right foot. This small, innocuous injury became the site of a deep infection that grew steadily worse. Jerry couldn't sleep with the pain. He couldn't walk on his foot. He was prescribed antibiotics and painkillers, of course, but their impact seemed to be minuscule and deathly slow. He was reduced to crawling on the floor, and the agony was excruciating. There are moments when you are suffering from chronic and sustained pain where ultimately death just seems preferable. You may not want to die, but it somehow seems easier than living a life of agony and torture, and Jerry certainly felt this, and all because of a small cut on his foot. And all the while, despite thinking that this amulet may be the source of all of this trouble and strife, Jerry still held on to it, determined to solve the mystery. He now decided that he needed to know what this thing was made of, and with the help of Dr. Patrick Quinn, he was able to find out. Dr. Quinn was an expert in ceramic petrography, so had the tools to be able to determine what the amulet was made of. He took a small sample of the effigy and determined that it was completely unlike any ceramic he knew. It definitely wasn't human, there was no flesh or bone present, and the amulet was made up of a hydrocarbon, some man-made substance with a calcium-bearing substance mixed in, like a resin mixed with crushed up stones. But Jerry was no closer to understanding what the hell this thing was and what it had been used for. When he had given the amulet to Dr. Quinn, he had done so on the proviso that Dr. Quinn only cut off the smallest piece he could from the amulet, and from a place that would not be noticeable or would not damage the look or integrity of the amulet. Dr. Quinn had obliged. And Jerry realised something that seemed to reinforce that this object was the source of his pain and misfortune. In a strange little synchronicity, Dr. Quinn had removed a slice from the amulet on the sole of the right foot, the exact place that Jerry had had his injury that had caused him so much pain. It was time to let go of the amulet. Jerry's parents had moved in and he was not willing to allow this chaos to continue to befall him, his family, and his parents. It may not have been the amulet. It may have just been a weird coincidence that all of this negativity had happened when he acquired it, but he wasn't willing to continue to take the risk. He removed the amulet from the house, performed a cleansing ritual, and then sold it at a loss. He was, admittedly, a bit disappointed at having to get rid of the thing, but when it was gone, life seemed to become more even and calm. The waves of negativity ceased, but the amulet still had a hold over Jerry. He wanted to know once and for all where it had come from and what it had been used for. So he continued searching for answers. Ultimately, he eventually deduced that the amulet had likely come from Thailand. And the folklore behind this is a bit grim, so I apologise in advance, but I'll try to lessen the super gory details. There was a folk story back in the 1500s about two childhood best friends who became rivals and competed for the love of a beautiful woman. Tale as old as time. The hero of the story realises that one of his wives is poisoning him at the behest of her father, and so he stabs her to death. Being well versed in the ways of magic, he cuts their unborn child from the mother's womb and uses the fetus to perform a series of magical rituals. These rituals ultimately culminate in him roasting the fetus over the fire and painting it with a gold leaf. This ritual created what is known as a Kumantong, a golden child, which is a powerful protective spirit. As with all folk tales, there are variations and differences that spring up over the years. Nowadays, a Kumantong is generally considered to be the spirit of a dead child that inhabits an object, and they are protective spirits. Kumantep are the ghosts of fetuses or infants and are generally, like the former, seen as positive and protective spirits. But there is another category, Kuman Frey. These are fetuses which have died violently and are particularly powerful and can cause serious harm if they are not revered in the correct way. Nowadays, Kumintang are generally displayed as ceramic dolls of little children that are believed to be imbued with the spirits of deceased children. But there are many traditional Kumintang charms still on display in Thai Buddhist monasteries. And by traditional, I mean that these were actual fetuses, including one that the monks in that particular monastery say still continues to grow. And in a wider, more general sense, two-headed effigies are considered to be the most powerful. Is it possible that this amulet was designed to be a vessel for the spirit of a child, whether that child had died in natural or in violent circumstances? Jerry had never suffered in the way that he suffered when the amulet was in his possession, either before or since. He had never, and has not since, suffered the mental and physical strife that he endured. Of course, there is always the possibility that this theory is simply a case of apophenia, when we look for meanings and patterns in random events. But what if it isn't? Now, wasn't that a wild little ride? And if you're new around here, that video of myself and Dan opening the Dybbuk box, it is on YouTube. It is still there, I believe. And I genuinely did, at the time, walk a couple of streets away from the house to deposit the Dybbuk box in a bin, like a public bin, because I was like, oh shit, what if this is real? What if I bring this into my house and then I actually am cursed? And then who'll be laughing then? Because it won't be me. I don't even remember what was in the box when we opened it, but it honestly was just a load of dusty old shit that people were like trying to make look creepy. And fair play to them, because there's gobshites like me that will pay money for this stuff. And I did see the original Dybbuk box in Zach Bagan's Haunted Museum. So I went to Zach Bagan's museum last year when I was in Vegas, and I had originally planned to make a video about it, and then I didn't, because I fundamentally disagreed with some of the displays that he had on display in the museum, and I kind of complained about it at the time. I thought it was wildly inappropriate. It was basically, there's a lot of serial killer and murdery stuff in the museum, and basically one of the rooms contained really hideous images of the victims, and contained like bed sheets covered in the victims' blood, underwear of the victims, like really like stuff that I thought was wildly inappropriate. Anyway, so that's why I never kind of made a video about it. But I did see the Dybbuk box, and do you know what? He's done a really good job at making it spooky in that room. It's in this protective glass case with loads of protective stuff written around it, and I didn't find it, like, nothing happened while I was there. But other people that were in the groups, you know, said they got a bad vibe off it. Famously, Post Malone believed that it cursed him. It's also not a real story. But here's the thing, is the power of curses basically the power that we give them, the power of belief? And then when you attribute bad things that happen to the curse, is that essentially making the curse real? And that is your deep existential question for today. Now, I've got to say, right, I loved this story when I read it. It was such a weird little story. It wasn't even like, you know, a headline story in this edition of Fortean Times. And I just loved it. I thought it was a really interesting story. But would I keep this fucking thing in my house for 956 days? I would not. No way. The minute something went wrong in my life, that amulet would be gone. I was going to say I'd boot it out the window. I wouldn't. I would respectfully give it to somebody who either I didn't like to pass the curse on to them, or to somebody who knew how to look after the damn thing. Ultimately, I respect the desire to own unique and quirky things, right? But I don't know if I'd respect it that much, do you know? And I will post a picture of the amulet on Instagram, Facebook, and on Patreon, so people can actually see what it looks like. It is a scary looking little thing. It's like, it is literally an emaciated two-headed fetus, and it gives me the heebie-jeebies. And I do also respect genuinely the lengths that Jerry went to in order to try and understand what this thing was and what it had been used for. And I did find it interesting that all of the different experts seem to have kind of differing opinions on what this was and what it was used for. Like originally, Vladimir Zwalf, who was the person who was working in the Department of Oriental Antiquities in the British Museum, said, you know, that was the card that came with it, and said that this object was about the Bonpo tradition and the Pola male god and the Mola female god kind of coming together. And, you know, that's really interesting. But ultimately, it wasn't correct. And I think it was the first expert that we encountered, so Professor Ramble, who said, yep, I've been studying this for a really long time and I actually don't think the card adds anything of value. I don't think it adds any information that is useful in this instance. And I think that the text is some sort of red herring, right? Which leaves us nowhere. It's like, oh brilliant. Well, then what's going on? Who added the text? Why did Vladimir write that information? Was he just surmising? Was he just guessing? Potentially. And how, if this thing did come from the British Museum, how did it end up on some random eBay seller being bought by just a guy? Because I would be contacting the eBay seller and being like, where did you get this from? Show me the original listing. Did the original listing come with a narrative like the Dybbuk box original one did, that was like, all of these terrible things happened since this box came into my presence? Or was it just like, here's a quirky little artifact that I think people would like. How did you end up getting this? And I'm not entirely sure if I was clear enough with this in the story. So a stupa is like a dome-shaped shrine, right? And the Professor Ramble seemed to suggest that the text that came with the little amulet, that came with the little object, was a text that was taken from one of these dome-shaped shrines, that it would have been carved into the top of one of these dome-shaped shrines, and that is what the text, that's where the text would have come from. But like, the minute that man said to me, I can't imagine that any Tibetan would regard this as being something other than strange or dangerous, I'd be getting rid of it then. I'd be like, okay, well, obviously this expert is saying that Tibetan people would have thought this is a dangerous thing to have. I'm getting rid of it. I'm not taking the risk. And then to top it off, when Dimitri's like, if you don't know what this is for, get rid of it. Like, man, that is a sure sign to get that thing out of your house. The general rule of thumb being, if you don't know what it's for, don't buy it, don't take it. That's a good rule of thumb when it comes to bringing cursed items into your house. If you're looking at this thing and you're like, this is a genuine spiritual religious artifact, but I have no idea what it was used for, do not bring it into your house. I think it's also important to note that at this point in the story, he's talking about his body being covered in scratches and not really understanding where these scratches came from. Jerry does say at the end of the article that earlier in life, he had experienced these same mysterious scratches along with experiences with a succubus. Now, I generally don't talk about succubi on the podcast. I have very strong feelings about the psychological aspects that are at play when people talk about succubi incidents, right? That's just my opinion. And I do feel like whatever you believe the origins of succubi are, whether you think it's psychological or whether you think it's genuinely paranormal, one thing is certain is that it's a sleep disruptor, right? And I think it's really interesting that Jerry says that, you know, in previous years he had these scratches, etc., when he was having succubi, you know, incidents. Was that disrupting his sleep? Most likely. So was he sleep deprived? Most likely. Was weird things happening in his sleep? Most likely. And that might be psychological, that might be paranormal. I would lean more towards psychological. Interestingly, during this period of time when he gets the amulet, he talks about how he sort of, you know, falls into a bit of a depression and develops insomnia. Again, we have this pattern of disturbed sleep and scratches. And the problem with this is that you could interpret this either way. You could say the disturbed sleep and the scratches are symptomatic of some sort of parasomnia, that he is actually doing this to himself just in a sleep state and genuinely doesn't know, understand, remember how this is happening. Or equally, you could say that this parasomnia, this insomnia is caused by some sort of paranormal intrusion in his life. You know, both of those things could be said. And he talks about having really, really bad dreams, which, you know, some sort of sleep disturbance was happening. That is for sure. I do think the sort of poltergeist type activity, like the book falling over and the thing, the little object jumping off the mantelpiece, falling over, I do think they're strange. I think it's interesting that the second incident is witnessed by a friend, and Jerry names the friend in the article. His name is Terry, which I found very funny, genuinely, simply because it rhymed, Jerry and Terry. Like that's the level of humour that tickles me. And it sounds like Jerry had some sort of I don't know, petit mal seizure, some sort of absent seizure, and then this object jumps off the ledge, and he specifically says like it jumped off the mantelpiece. And I think it's important to point out as well that he does say in the article, you know, shit things happen. Like, shit things happen to people. That doesn't mean you're cursed. But his thing is, I just think it's weird that all of this stuff started happening when, you know, I brought this amulet into the house. And I am also going to argue, like, your dog becoming ill and having to be put down is an awful thing to happen, right? That is horrendous. We all know how we all feel about pets dying. It's awful. We all hate it. And then, you know, close relatives and a neighbour passing away. Yes, again, that is awful. But it is not exclusive to Jerry and his family. You know what I mean? I'm sure that his neighbour's family who passed away, I'm sure they were absolutely devastated. I'm sure their world was turned upside down by the death of their neighbour. I'm sure other family members were absolutely devastated by the death of the family members that he describes, you know? And he does say in the article that those deaths were not sudden. They weren't unexpected. So I just feel a bit like, yes, all of these negative things happening are awful, but sometimes negative things happen in waves and you feel like, geez, I can't ever escape this. And I'm probably going to sound like an absolute knob, right? And I'm going to sound really critical and cynical in this episode. You know, when you're in a state of depression, he's obviously not sleeping. He says himself, he's not sleeping properly. He is not looking after himself properly. You are more likely to get infections and stuff because your body can't fight them. If your immune system is low because you're not sleeping, you're not looking after yourself, because you're in emotional turmoil. Like, emotional turmoil deeply impacts your immune system. You are more likely to get sick, unfortunately. To be really honest, there are elements of this story that I think are really strange, like the poltergeist elements, like the scratches that appeared when him and his wife were getting ready. I'm not convinced by that, but I do think it's strange. I think it's interesting. I think the little amulet itself is strange. Like, it's a strange, scary little object. Like, I would be curious to know what happened to the person who he sold the amulet to. Did he sell the amulet to somebody and say, look, all of this negative stuff has happened to me since I've owned this. Be warned, you know, this is something that is potentially dangerous. Did anything happen to the person who bought it from him, who now owns it? Or, you know, is it somewhere else again? And here's the thing, right? Shit things happened. Negative things did happen. That's not up for dispute. People died. His dog died. He got really sick. Poltergeist events happened around the house. You know, he got scratches all over his body. He was emotionally charged. Negative things happened. If you attribute these things to the curse, does that in essence make the curse real? Because that is a pretty big question. And the final thing I'm going to say about this is that I think it's really interesting that, you know, finally he deduced that this thing had come from Thailand and it was essentially a golden child, a Kumantong, potentially. You know, there's no kind of definitive proof that is where this thing came from. And I wonder if it was never anything to do with Bon, and that was just wrongly accredited in the beginning, and then everybody went down that path instead of thinking about other options. This idea of fetuses being imbued with protective spirits, etc., etc. I tried not to dwell too much on that because I can imagine for a lot of people it's a very upsetting topic. And I will warn you that when I was reading this and writing it, it triggered a memory for me where I was like, I've read an article about this before, about this sort of black market for fetuses for this particular reason, to make these protective charms. And just word of warning, if you're going to dive into this, it can be a pretty distressing topic because there is a black market for fetuses and using those fetuses in order to basically make these charms. And it was quite difficult reading, so I'm going to warn you, if you're going to dive into this topic anymore, it's a tricky one to dive into. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Remember, all of the information for today's episode came from the Fortean Times, October 2023, issue number 436. And the story is by a man called Jerry Glover. All the information, as always, is going to be linked in the show notes for this episode. Thank you as always for listening. If you've got a story that you would like to share, you can email it to me at reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
As dawn broke over the seven seas, the pirates of the Crimson Galleon set sail for adventure. But there was one problem: paperwork. Mountains of it. Filing, invoices, you name it.
This work ain't fit for a pirate.
Luckily, their captain had an idea. She used the smart buying tools on Amazon Business, so they could work more efficiently and get back to doing what they do best. I know, right? Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying.